Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
And we post every week on a Friday, so hit subscribe if you want to know what we're doing next week and follow our continuing adventure.
And don't forget, we do shorts on a Monday. So if you've got a question that you'd like me to answer for you, put it in the comments below. Tell me where you're from so that I've got context and we'll try and answer your questions.
We will indeed. And Stephen, the sun is shining. The leaves are turning,
Yes.
Autumn in Mount Macedon. What are we doing today?
We're visiting some French gardens.
Aha! In spring.
In spring.
Lucky you, you were there in spring last year.
Yes. Not only do we visit the sort of expected formal grand gardens of France, but we visit some modern collectors' gardens, which are probably more on the English style of garden-esque type gardens, woodlandy gardens, but gardens that belong to serious plant collectors.
Oh, which you have, despite the language barrier, a great affinity with. But first of all, contextualize, why were you there?
Well, I was leading a tour.
Yes.
And of course, I'm doing it again in 2025. So if you like what you see today, you might like to join me on an Australian studying abroad tour of Northwest France.
You can indeed. I'll put the links below. Of course, I'm not invited, but Stephen has been the
You
host.
could come if you paid your own way, Matthew.
Could you imagine? It's outrageous. But we'll put the links below. You don't have to be in or an Australian,
No.
nor do you have to study per se. They're really just tours led by specialists, and they have specialist tours about art, design, gardens,
architecture,
food.
everything, you
Yeah.
name it. And yes, I might set your exam at the end, but probably not.
All right, so there's the scene set. Now, where are we in France generally? Are these sorts of gardens in one particular area?
Yeah, well, the collectors' gardens do tend to congregate in the northwest.
Why?
So, well, because of climate. You've got adequate rain,
Yeah.
pretty well all year round.
Yeah.
In fact, it nearly always rains on you at least once on tour. You've got good deep soils, there's streams flowing everywhere, and the climate is slightly maritime because it's quite close to the coast, so it doesn't get too sort of frightfully cold.
Yeah.
And so they can grow a wonderful palette of plants. And so obviously anybody who's a plant collector wants to be collecting where they can grow plants well.
Yeah.
And so that part of the world, Normandy and Brittany particularly, have attracted some amazing modern plant collectors.
Okay, so where are we going first?
All right, well, we're going to visit a garden called Jardin d'Angélique.
Yes.
Now, it started off just as the large house chateau on the block with nothing. And the people who bought it tragically lost their daughter quite young. And they decided as a monument to their daughter, they were going to create a garden. And they did. And they went in boots and all. I mean, they weren't horticulturalists. They weren't particularly plant collectors when they started, but they read, they understood what they should do with the soil, they worked on it, and they've created basically two gardens. Behind the house is basically a formal rose garden, and that was the first part they did, and I think they've got well over 200 different roses in there, and it was basically the monument to their daughter. But of course they had land around them. So they have a beautiful little natural stream that runs right through the middle of the property. And so the front of the property going right down to the street has been turned into this amazing woodland with wandering little paths wandering all over the place. Fabulous plant collection. I mean, there's cultivars and varieties in there that I hadn't come across before that they've been collecting from all over France and probably from Britain as well.
And also a point that we've made before about plant collecting and having such a garden in Europe is that you can import that material, whereas in Australia you can't bring in live plants, and it's actually very hard to bring in seeds now.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, which might not be a good thing, but anyway,
it has its ups and downs.
Yeah, you can take whatever you want.
Yeah, and they do. I mean, some of these gardens have plants from all over the world. In one or two cases, I know that the owners of these gardens have been out actually collecting in the wild and bought plant material back. So in some cases, they've got plants that are possibly the only ones of their type certainly in France and maybe even in Europe. And it's probably one of the few places I've been to visit gardens where I can walk into gardens and see things I've never seen before. So, and for me, that's really exciting, particularly if the owner actually does know what they're growing so that they can tell me all about it.
Does it not, though, pangs of jealousy?
Oh,
Stephen?
yes. My little heart skips when I see some rare, wonderful plant in somebody's garden, and then it drops because I know I can't bring it back. But I can take a picture and I can enjoy the exercise of seeing these things. And it's a learning curve for me as well, because I might not be able to grow all these plants, but it's broadening my knowledge about them. So I'm happy to do it, but if I didn't look guilty as I came through customs, I could easily become a smuggler, I have to say.
All right, let's leave Angelique. Where are we going next?
All right, Jardin de Valériane, and again, it's the passion of a couple. So a husband and wife team that built a house on a piece of meadow, I guess, and started planting and haven't learned how to stop.
Well, you haven't either.
Yeah.
So what was there before? Was there any garden?
Nothing. There was no garden whatsoever. Right. They started by creating walkways and paths and things and then planting the beds. And it's a garden that is concentrated with plants. I mean, it would be really hard to poke a weed in some of these beds. The plants are so dense. There's ground covers, there's middle layer plants, there's trees and shrubs above, and they're all good quality varieties. Again, they're people that have got a good eye for a plant, and they've collected the best varieties of anything they can, and they've combined their plants really well. There's good textural quality, colour combinations. The whole thing works exceedingly well, right down to the very smart grass paths, I have to say.
Although perhaps not that practical if you've got a lot of visitors.
Yeah.
Now, what's this fabulous shrub?
It's a shrub called Neillia thibetica.
Is it from?
Tibet. I'm assuming not strictly just Tibet. It will be southern China-ish. But Neillia was until recently a tiny little genus of about 3 or 4 species. It's had plants known as Stephanandra included into that genus now. So Neillia has got a little bigger, although Stephanandra was about the same size. And they're all deciduous shrubs. Many of them colour quite nicely in the autumn. And they're elegant archy sort of plants. So they make a really nice shaped plant. Most of them are summer flowering, so that's useful in its own right.
Yeah.
None of them are showy to a large extent, though. They're just gentle, attractive sort of filler shrubs.
Well, that's very beautiful, very beautiful. I mean, to your point, not a weed in sight, not a space in sight. What's this understory plant?
All right, well, that big drift is one of the Persicarias, the knotweeds, and I think we've engaged with 1 or 2 knotweeds over the period of time, and it's spelled K-N-O-T, and they can be very useful weed smothering ground cover plants in the garden, and of course there's 1 or 2 that have got a little bit over the top and become a problem. But anyhow.
Yes. Now there's also that fabulous cedar which has the bright pink red new foliage.
Yes, the Toona sinensis Flamingo Chinese cedar. It's a wonderful small tree, masses of pink foliage in the spring, so it gives you colour over a longer period than something that flowers, because flowers tend to be more fragile. So the foliage is there for ages, and you can eat it. If you want to pick the leaves off. But
well,
there you go.
There you go.
Now these people, well, a bit like me, they can't stop at a boundary. And once
you have no boundaries.
Yeah, well, that's true. When they filled their garden, they started looking around. You know, what could they do to keep gardening? And it just so happened a meadow on the other side of the little road, the country lane that they live on, was available for sale. So again, another completely blank canvas. I think it might have had an outbuilding on it, but that's about all. Certainly no garden. So they took over the other side of the road, I'm assuming they purchased it, and started gardening on the other side. So they added water features in, all sorts of interesting paving effects, and started collecting yet again. And so they've got masses of dogwoods and maples and mollis azaleas, some fantastic varieties of those.
That is an incredible colour, the one we're looking at now.
Oh, that yellow.
But it's looking very woody. Those trees look to me like very established. So when was this garden planted?
It's still being planted, I might add. There's new things going in all the time. But the whole garden was probably only started 25, 30 years ago.
Right.
But, you know, they've got that deep, beautiful meadow soil. They spend every waking hour in the garden looking after and tending their plants.
Oh, if only.
Yeah, so, you know, the plants get the best of all worlds and have grown remarkably well. So it's a very surprisingly well-advanced garden for its age.
All right, well, let's go on to the next garden. Where are we going next?
Jardin de Castillon. This one also started as a nursery. And the owners, who I saw last year, and I'm sure Monsieur was 90 or 91 or something like that. So he's early 90s, still looking after his garden to a large extent.
Excellent.
He has help, of course, to mow the grass and do some of the heavier work. Still as sharp as a tack. speaks quite good English, so that helped me a lot. So it started as a nursery, and in its era, the nursery was started, I think, back in the 70s or 80s. Perennial plant material in France wasn't particularly common. We had the formal gardens and all that sort of stuff, but gardening with perennials was a new thing in France.
Right.
So he decided he would design a garden in which he could show off the plants that he was selling, and it sort of got away with him.
I must say, looking at it, it looks a little bit sort of Sissinghurst-y.
It is in a sense. I mean, it's broken up into rooms. I'm not sure I approve of that term exactly, but everybody knows what we mean. And so there's different themes as you go through. So there's a specifically water garden area. There's an area with lots of hedging and topiary. So there's a sort of more formalised area. There's sort of a woodland. There's perennial borders. There's a Japanese-esque part of the garden with cloud pruning and all that sort of thing. So the whole garden just sort of kept growing. The nursery basically doesn't exist anymore. And so basically they just spend their time with their garden, which is lovely.
Lovely. I love that combination of allium and hosta.
Yeah, we couldn't do that here because the hostas would need too much water and the alliums would rot. So how they get away with it is just because of the climatic zone they're in. So they can actually grow those bulbs through a hosta, and the hosta doesn't burn, but the bulbs don't rot. So we just couldn't do that here.
All right, Stephen, on to the next.
All right, well, this garden was a new one to me last year when we visited.
Yeah.
Jardin de Petit
Bordeaux.
Bordeaux.
What an accent, Stephen.
Yeah,
You'd be mistaken for a local.
Yeah, I could. Ha, ha, ha. Now, this again is another garden created by a couple who just can't stop. They had what they bought was actually a woodland. So they bought a woodlot of large trees, mainly European things like beech and oak and so forth, and built their house in amongst it, started putting in ponds, and then created lovely little walkways all through the garden and collected plants. And this collection is remarkable. I mean, they've got a huge array of hostas of all sorts of different varieties, and you can see images of all the different variegated ones and forms that they've collected. They've got fabulous azaleas, beautiful maples, some really amazing dogwoods. So all of the sort of classical things you would expect that a keen and enthusiastic gardener would collect. So it really is quite an atmospheric and interesting garden. And one of the plants that we've got an image as I walk past is one that you don't see in gardens very often, which I think is sad. I know why, because it's comparatively difficult to propagate, but it's a plant called Dipelta, Dipelta floribunda. And for those who know what a Weigela looks like in flower, it has pink bells, or in Weigela it can be several colours, but in Dipelta it's pale pink. So you get these pink bell-like flowers in the early spring, but when the flowers are finished, you get these wonderful coppery pink papery seed pods that form in clusters all over the branches. It also has quite nice autumn colour before it sheds, and in the winter it has quite nice bark that sort of strips off in thin layers, and it's a very pale coloured bark.
Where's it from?
The Dipeltas, I might add, there's only 2 or 3 species in the genus, are from China, because one of them is called Yunnanensis for obvious reasons. So there you go. So interesting little, large shrub / small tree.
And I must say, I'm not a lover of daylilies, but the daylily that you started your footage with is quite beautiful.
Yeah, look, daylilies are one of those things that people either become absolutely besotted by and become mad keen collectors. Others can't give them the time of day.
For me, it's because they literally are for a day, and so you've always got a dead flower, always.
Yes, well, a lot of the newer hybrids they're producing tend to shed their flowers, so they tend to drop off. So if they can get them to do that, well, that makes a big difference. And the overall flowering period can be quite long with daylilies. I think my issue with daylilies is there's some quite good strong primary colours, but a lot of the colours are sort of muted and muddy and slightly bizarre, actually, I have to say. There's lots of browns and chocolatey colours that tend to show up in daylilies, and they're not to everybody's taste. I'd like a good clean yellow one or a nice bright red one, but some of those strangely coloured ones I think are an acquired taste.
I'm also loving the bright red garden furniture.
Yes.
Why not?
That is one of those things that people are often quite hesitant to do something sort of a little bit cheery and bright in the garden. And I think bright colours in garden furniture are actually fabulous. And red stands out beautifully in a garden all year round. Yeah, I think it's fabulous.
It is. Well, what a beautiful romp through the plant collector's gardens. Now, of course, you can collect plants in any climate. You can be an alpine collector, you can have an arid garden, a Mediterranean garden, cactus garden. But I guess because this is so temperate and mild, there's a huge sort of breadth of plants from all over the world that can be grown in them.
Certainly is.
Where's our last journey, Stephen?
All right, well, this garden is a bit of a crossover garden. It's a collector's garden to a large extent, but it is a very informal garden that's been worked into the natural landscape, and it's really the garden of an artist. So although it has lots of interesting plants in it, it's more about the design and forms of the garden. So the landscape has been gently contoured and changed slightly to make it more artistic.
Now, I get it. That's it's a bit of a trend now, do you think? And I don't think I love it, Stephen.
No.
For me, it seems so imposed and so artificial. I guess that's the point, that it just, I don't know, I just don't dig it.
I think this one is one of those gardens that you have to have the genius behind the garden, and in this case, he's now dead, unfortunately, but a relative of his owns the garden and understands the ethos behind it, because it was done with an artistic eye. There were areas that were opened up to show the view. There were other areas that closed off to hide the view. There were copses and bosses of trees that were put in to create certain effects, and the ground was actually sculpted in a quite artistic way. But it's a very subtly organised garden, Le Bois de Morville, and it's not a garden that's easy to get into, so it's quite a challenge to actually get permission to go there, and we were lucky enough to go there. And because we were shown around by this relative of the original landscape designer, we were able to understand what was trying to be done. And some gardens, you do need to have it explained to you. And this particular one is one of those that may not enthuse everybody, but once it's properly explained and the theories and practices behind it are given to you, then once you understand it, you can actually get much more out of it. So it's one of those gardens that takes a bit of deep thinking.
Oh, okay, which I'm incapable of. Well,
I did not say that.
But I suppose, you know, creating a terrace is no different to creating a series of humps. I don't know, but yeah, it just seems very unnatural, I suppose. But that's the whole point.
Well, I have to say, though, my footage may or may not exude romanticism, but I have to say the place itself did.
Oh, it does look beautiful.
Yeah, it's very romantic. I mean, you wander around it, you could be sort of 6 inches off the ground, you wouldn't notice. It's just one of those really romantic, beautiful sites. Wow. And it has got a lot of collector's plants, but they're not obvious. So it's a really interesting combination of landscape design and collector's plants, I guess.
Well, that ends our romp through the collector's gardens of Normandy and Brittany. If you want to go with Stephen on a romp in 2025, probably a very similar itinerary.
Yes.
We'll put the link below. As we mentioned, you don't have to be an Australian or in Australia to be able to go on any of these trips.
Yep.
And they're not studying in terms of exams being set afterwards.
No, but I'm assuring you that you will learn stuff, and that's what it's about.
And a great opportunity to see many gardens that aren't open to the public that you couldn't perhaps normally do.
Oh, yes.
Of course, I shan't be there, but never mind.
Oh, well, when we become rich and famous from YouTube.
We can indeed. Yes. Well, if you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe.
And don't forget to put comments and questions in the comments section below, because I answer your questions in our 60-second shorts on a Monday.
You do indeed. But until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.